And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
America no longer leads the world in energy dominance. What if I told you that it is Canada and Qatar that are now breaking the whole established pattern? While the US continues to shout about America first, these two countries have emerged out of nowhere as key players in the energy market, forcing America to take a backseat and watch. Canadian and Qatari giants are signing multi-billion-dollar contracts with European countries, redistributing the global flow of gas. What is America doing? Nothing. US gas prices are skyrocketing, and the energy industry is in its deepest crisis in decades.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Let's imagine for a moment how America's energy supremacy is crumbling before our eyes. While not so long ago America was the largest supplier of oil and gas, today, thanks to its policy mistakes and archaic strategy, it risks being relegated to the margins of the energy market. Canadian gas projects are receiving massive investments, while Qatar, the Gulf states, are signing long-term contracts with giants like Germany and Italy, the very countries with which America once competed for energy leadership. And now it is these countries that control a huge portion of Europe's gas supply.
U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
But here's what's even more interesting. When President Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian gas, he seemed to be protecting the national interest. But those tariffs ended up being the catalyst for what led to a crisis in the US energy sector. Canada and Qatar didn't wait. They quickly diverted their resources, signed more favorable deals with Europe, and the US was left on the sidelines. Multi-billion-dollar contracts are gone irrevocably, and America now has to face the consequences. Where will this all lead to? The US may soon be forced to buy gas from countries that were once considered competitors.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
But that's not all. As OPEC cuts oil production, raising prices and forcing the US market to double dip, the threat of a global economic recession grows. What happens if oil rises even more? How would that affect the US economy? We can't forget another threatening variable, the electric car revolution. While the US is still wasting away on the old model of shale oil production, countries like Qatar and Canada are already building a clean and energy future. Watch this video to understand how the world's energy landscape is changing, why America is missing its chances, and what it means for you, your wallets, and the future of the entire global economy.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
The world of energy is undergoing a real upheaval. While just a few years ago it seemed that the United States would dominate the global energy market, things have changed. The United States is no longer the sole superpower in the energy sector. That title is now shared by Canada and Qatar, two completely unexpected players who have become powerful competitors for the United States. As a result, we have witnessed stunning changes in the oil and gas market. Suddenly, for Europe and elsewhere, America no longer looks as attractive a partner as it once did. Canadian and Qatari projects are booming, and their energy resources are becoming a critical element in the geopolitical strategies of world powers. Canada has, in fact, become the new energy center for Europe. In 2023, the largest deal in Canadian energy history was signed, multi-billion-dollar contracts with several leading EU countries, including Germany, France, and the UK. Against this backdrop, Canadian policymakers quickly strengthened ties with major energy companies and took a more active stance in international energy forums. Canadian gas exports to Europe are expected to increase by 40% in 2025. This growth is fueled by the launch of new gas projects in British Columbia and elsewhere in the country, where the country's most powerful oil and gas fields have long since begun to come online. A situation in which not so long ago America was the dominant player now appears to be the exact opposite. Canadian investments in liquefied natural gas, LNG, technology and gasification of fields under strict environmental standards are allowing the country not only to capture the European market, but also to gradually become the largest supplier to Asia. European countries gratefully accept Canadian supplies, which are as good in price and quality as American ones, without Canada having to take into account the tariffs and trade barriers America places on its partners. But Qatar may have become an even more undeniable competitor. This small but hugely influential Gulf state has dramatically increased its ambitions in the global energy market. Qatar is not just supplying gas to Europe as America used to do. It has become a central figure in the energy supply market, making deals for decades to come. In 2024, Qatar signed a contract with Germany to supply gas until 2045, making it Germany's main supplier, second only to Russia in the time before the Ukraine conflict. Qatari authorities and corporations are actively working to expand their LNG capacity, and the country plans to double its supply to Europe by 2026, making it even more competitive. For European countries, especially in the wake of the instability following the crisis in Eastern Europe, Qatari gas has become not only a profitable but also a strategic choice. EU countries desperate for reliable energy supplies are entering into agreements with Qatar that are rewriting the history of global energy. Qatar becomes not only a gas supplier, but also a partner in alternative energy and hydrogen technologies, in which the country is already making significant strides forward.
With Elon Musk's views and weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
Now consider what is happening with the United States. These countries, such as Canada and Qatar, have begun to play by the rules of the global energy market, while the US cannot even choose a clear strategy. As a result, the global energy market has changed significantly, and Americans now look at the growing scale of Canadian and Qatari projects with increasing alarm. The American energy industry that once dominated the world is now literally sliding into a depression. Experts recognize that America has lost many opportunities to strengthen its energy position, but that doesn't mean all is lost. In 2022, the US set a record for shale oil production, but despite this, America still faces huge challenges. Excess oil reserves, high production costs and inefficient methods of resource extraction put the US at a disadvantage. The country has even begun to experience economic problems due to production costs and the instability of the oil sector, and holding back on environmental standards only makes matters worse.
Is that ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
On the policy side, the US has continued to pursue an outdated strategy in recent years, trying to solve its problems with tariffs and tax breaks for extractive companies. However, for other countries, such as Canada and Qatar, these methods have not been attractive. Countries began bypassing the US by signing deals that paid them big dividends. Canadian projects focused on clean gas production against this backdrop look like a true energy breakthrough that not only attracts investors, but also strengthens national interests. On the other hand, Qatari initiatives have been the starting point for a global shift in energy policy. The strategy aimed at long-term contracts with European countries has allowed Qatar to significantly strengthen its position on the world stage.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
For the US, on the other hand, the situation is only getting worse. Gas prices in the country have begun to soar to new heights, and the country's energy policy has failed to provide a clear answer to the challenges posed by Canada and Qatar. While the US is losing its former power, neighboring countries are doing their best to secure their place among the world's energy leaders. Tariffs imposed back under Trump now seem not only ineffective but also highly counterproductive. Canada and Qatar are no longer dependent on America and are looking for ways to empower themselves on the international stage. America, a country that once prided itself on its energy power, now finds itself in a situation where it will have to pay for gas that it used to sell to others. The situation is becoming more critical by the day. The US is essentially left with two choices. Either it can adapt its strategy to the new environment and take decisive steps in innovation and technology, or it will have to watch Canada and Qatar take over global markets.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
The US, once the greatest energy giant, now finds itself on the verge of losing its place in the global energy market. The story of the US oil and gas industry, once a great power that supplied the needs of a multitude of countries, now looks more like a reflection of old glories. Perhaps most surprisingly, the country, with its vast resources and technology, has never been able to build an effective long-term strategy to protect its position. When Canada and Qatar dramatically increased their export capacity, the US was faced with a stark choice: reform its policies or stay put while watching the energy world move on. In the meantime, all we see is attempts to fix gas and oil tariffs, while other countries like Canada and Qatar have long been signing deals that the US can only dream of. Let's not forget that it was Trump's tariff policies that played a key role in the current US energy crisis. When the Canadian gas tariff package was introduced in 2017, it seems that the US action was intended to support the domestic market. However, the move was only a catalyst that accelerated Canada and Qatar's abandonment of close economic ties with America. Then, in response to unreasonably high tariffs, Canada, which had previously been perceived as a supplier dependent on the US, began to reconsider its foreign economic ties. Soon they had lucrative contracts with Europe, including France and Britain. Agreements signed for decades to come ensured that Canada would no longer be in the shadow of the US, and the European Union would have a new, more profitable source of energy.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Qatar, in turn, quickly carved out a niche as a supplier of liquefied natural gas to countries like Germany and the Netherlands, countries that had previously focused on U.S. sources. While this was a blow to the U.S. economic power, it was a salvation for Europe, as they were able to reduce their dependence on American gas. Instead of constraining America through tariffs, the Gulf and North American countries effectively built their domestic strategies. Qatar, becoming not just a supplier but a true gas hub, signed major contracts that challenge American ability to control global energy flows for decades to come. Surprisingly, these countries not only increased exports but also began investing in new technologies such as hydrogen plants, making them even more attractive to Europe and Asia. However, the US, despite its power, has not been able to meet this challenge. It is becoming clear that the strategy of tariffs and short-term measures has not worked, and the United States now faces the need to reform its energy industry. However, US attempts to revitalize its former power in the energy sector through shale oil and gas have only caused new problems. Although US shale oil production has reached a record 13.49 million BEPT as of 2024, this still leaves the country out of the lead. The US energy industry faces a new challenge: the high cost of production. By comparison, the cost of shale oil in the US for 2024 was twice as high as the same Canadian projects, not to mention Qatari projects, which, given their high-quality extraction technologies, provide much lower refining costs. The situation is also complicated by inefficient redistribution of revenues and insufficient attention to environmental aspects, which has increased production costs and reduced US competitiveness in the international arena. America's oil giants are being forced to reduce investment in new projects and are increasingly turning their attention to addressing environmental issues that were ignored decades ago. America's oil and gas sector is trapped in a situation where the high cost of shale gas and oil production only exacerbates the problem. While Canada and Qatar are investing billions of dollars in new gas projects and clean technologies, the US risks being left behind because it continues to struggle with outdated production methods. In this context, OPEC has become the most important player to intervene in this energy crisis. OPEC's decision to cut oil production and thus raise prices on the world market had a decisive impact on the US oil industry. In response, the US has tried to increase shale production, but this does not address the underlying problem of high extraction and refining costs, as well as political and economic factors such as the impact of environmental standards and the requirements of international agreements. OPEC is in an advantageous position because its countries can produce oil at a much lower cost. While the US has to face unpredictable fluctuations in oil prices, OPEC stabilizes its position by managing prices in the international market. In addition, the future of the US oil industry now depends on how quickly it adapts to changing conditions. With its vast resources, the US must focus on new technologies that will help reduce production costs, as well as develop a strategy for long-term cooperation with other countries to keep up with giants such as Canada and Qatar. These countries have already demonstrated their ability to effectively manage their resources, creating not only profit but also prosperity for their economies. As for electric cars, this is also where the US faces a threat. The electric revolution, already underway in Europe and Asia, is beginning to change the world's energy needs. Electric cars are becoming not just a trend, but a reality. Forecasts claim that by 2025, global sales of electric cars will reach more than 20 million units. And this, in turn, will put pressure on the oil industry, reducing demand for traditional energy sources. Electric transportation is gradually displacing hydrocarbon fuels, and countries like China and Germany have already made strategic choices toward clean energy. Thus, the US, despite its technological strength, is in a vulnerable position. If it fails to adapt to new market conditions, it will inevitably find itself catching up as Canada and Qatar continue to strengthen their position and become more influential players in the global energy market every year. The world is changing, and the US energy landscape faces new and even greater challenges. The electric revolution already sweeping Europe and Asia is putting pressure on oil and gas that the US energy sector cannot ignore. In 2025, global electric vehicle sales are projected to reach 20 million units. This dramatic growth will create a huge shortfall in demand for gasoline and diesel, which is bound to affect the oil industry. This is not just a trend, but a reality in which oil could fall by the wayside. European and Asian markets are already beginning to abandon hydrocarbon energy sources en masse, citing economics, environmental concerns, and long-term projections. The US, however, is still tied to conventional energy, which continues to be expensive and environmentally inefficient, leading to an internal conflict between technological modernization and maintaining the oil industry as the main source of income. The situation with the US is becoming increasingly complex. Economists are starting to talk about a possible recession, which could be caused by both domestic problems and global energy instability. The US, as the largest oil and gas consumer in the world, is forced to take measures to reduce dependence on foreign supplies. The US president proposes to invest in shale oil, but the problem is that extracting this resource remains expensive and inefficient. The state of Texas, which has long been a center of oil production, is now facing an unprecedented decline in production. This is not only negatively impacting the state's economy, but also the country's overall picture. But even worse, the US has become dependent on imported gas. Every year, more and more gas is coming from Canada and Qatar. The prospect looms on the horizon that the US, despite its vast resources, will be forced to buy gas from other countries, when only a few decades ago that seemed impossible. This defeat was the result not only of a poor energy strategy, but a general lack of a unified policy to modernize the industry to compete with alternative energy. Canadian projects aimed at clean energy production and Qatari ambitions for hydrogen could be the leverage by which these countries create an energy alliance that will soon be not only beneficial but vital to Europe and Asia. This means that the US, already losing influence in the global energy market, will find itself in a position where it will be looking for new opportunities to avoid becoming completely dependent on foreign supplies. And while the economic situation continues to deteriorate and oil and gas companies face domestic challenges, only those countries that have bet on environmental and innovative technologies will be able to survive and thrive. When the world is ready for a new energy era, the US may find itself on the sidelines, watching Canada and Qatar secure the future they are already beginning to build.